Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or maybe even good evening. Welcome to our webinar today. So, have you ever missed a consumer trend in your company? Or even worse, have you been betting on a consumer trend that really didn't pay off to you? Then today's webinar is for you. We are going to talk about how to unpack opportunities in spaces that were previously either misunderstood or undervalued. My name is Arie van Berkel. I'm a Senior Vice President and Group Director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague Ujwal Arkalput. He's an Executive Vice President and Group Director here at Lux Research. Now, before we get started, we like to interact with you. So throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. On my screen, it's on the right side of my screen. There's questions and there's chat, and I'm talking about the questions box. Time permitting, we will answer all of those questions that we can during this webinar. If you don't have time, or if you have a question only after the webinar, don't hesitate, email us at questions@luxresearchinc.com. So that's questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll respond to you. So at this point, let's jump right in. Ujwal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi and welcome, everybody. How to unpack opportunities in spaces that are either undervalued, sometimes overvalued, misunderstood. This is obviously an important topic, a topic that is near and dear to all our hearts as anthropologists. And I'll start with a fairly famous quote from Bill Gates, which is really that we all tend to overestimate the change that will occur in the short term and underestimate the change that will occur in the long term. And this is, I think, largely a function of the fact that most of us, it doesn't matter whether we work in R&D, insights, and research or innovation, there is a level of misunderstanding or a lack of clarity in what we really define as a trend. And that is really the core issue I'd like to address today. Because one of the real reasons why we tend to miss the boat on valuing these opportunities in the right way is because we don't necessarily truly understand what makes a trend a trend. The better we can understand how trends really develop and how they take shape and form and what factors affect them along their journey, what might prevent them from potentially becoming a real trend, having relevancy to the mainstream, what might actually propel them further. The better we understand these issues, the better we get at predicting and valuing the opportunities before us. So that's really what we're going to dive into. It's really important for us to understand that no trend exists without tension in its contextual culture. Culture, in fact, in general, culture is made up of tension. You can think of it sort of like the tension that we are all used to seeing in the political spectrum, where the left and the beliefs they hold usually sit in direct opposition with the right and the beliefs they hold. But the same is true of culture in general. The way new ideas really are born and take shape is they all go through the same trajectory. They're born on this theoretical left end of the spectrum. They're born with some kind of an ideology, an ideological underpinning, a technical underpinning. And I'll explain this more as we go along. Somewhere along its journey for that ideology to take mainstream form, to take mainstream relevancy, it has to transform from being ideologically driven to connecting with something that is deeply human to all of us, to connecting with our vulnerabilities, i.e., it has to transform from an ideology into holding some form of social capital so that we feel vulnerable enough to want to acquire that solution, that product. Because if we don't acquire it, it exposes us somehow, makes us vulnerable because we're not, up on the latest trends. We're, staying back in time. We're not keeping up with what's happening in our social circles, blah, blah, blah. You know the deal. You're all consumers around here, around the table. We all are. And we all experience this sometimes, even in situations where we don't want to, we do. But that shift from ideology to vulnerability into mainstream acceptance is really fundamental to our ability to understanding how trends begin to take form, take shape. A simplified way to understand this framework is to think of it this way. On the left of the spectrum are small niche groups of consumers that hold very rigid beliefs. And on the right of the spectrum are also small groups of consumers that hold very rigid beliefs. Now, those rigid beliefs are not for the mainstream. They're not for the faint of heart. So for those rigid beliefs to make their way into the mainstream, those beliefs have to soften, and something has to be a catalyst for that softening to happen. And that is really fundamentally what truly has to happen for something to have mainstream relevancy. And that's a very common pattern. And I'll give you a very tangible example of that. If you think about the entire trend of these sort of hip coffee bars and coffee shops that we see around the world now, it doesn't matter where you go, you can walk in and have a really interesting cup of coffee. You will see lingo around how this cup of coffee is farmed, whether it's single origin, whether it's blended. You'll hear lingo about tasting notes. The reason all of this is now pretty mainstream is because it went on this trajectory from ideology to vulnerability. It began with small groups of consumers really concerned about the way coffee was grown, the way farmers were treated, the way trade happened, the unfair trade practices that existed along the way. Now, of course, the mainstream coffee drinker could not care less, as cynical as that sounds, could not care less about how the farmers treated or whether they're compensated fairly. So what gave then along the way? Along the way, basically what happened is the niche, ideological, technically knowledgeable groups of consumers that had technical knowledge about trade, about growing practices, about um, where coffee was grown around the world and so on and so forth. Somewhere along the way, another group of consumers came and they said, hey, in addition to all of this ideology that's happening around here, turns out when you start compensating farmers better and you start building these relationships with these farmers, you also suddenly get to appreciate or get access into the types of coffee beans that now will sort of carry you, will transport you to that region, will give you the tasting notes from that terroir, will help you understand and experience coffee in a completely different way, thereby transforming something that was deeply technical and ideological on the left end to something that basically becomes this cup of culture in the palm of your hands. Every time you take a sip of something, you are transported to the place where that thing comes from. Very reminiscent of course, wine tasting and wine culture that we're all used to seeing. Now, this transformation is really critical because there are two things to keep in mind. Yes, it's about ideology to vulnerability. What's the vulnerability? We all now need to feel like we've got access to good quality coffee. We can appreciate good quality coffee because our social circles are talking about it. Many of us will spend $700, $800 dollars or euros on machines, complex machines that we put in our kitchen counters and so on and so forth. That's the vulnerability piece. But another important thing here is that the left end of the spectrum usually has technical knowledge on a topic, and the middle of the spectrum has less technical knowledge. So in essence, as a culture comes to the middle and becomes mainstream, the knowledge required in order to access that part of cultures is drops basically significantly. It becomes more accessible. And we'll talk more about this pattern as we go along as well. So really, this is the journey of a trend. And this journey of a trend maps pretty nicely to the maturity curve that you're all used to seeing. Hopefully, this is not your very first webinar with us, but if it is, we'll talk a little bit more about that later in our session. But basically, it maps really nicely to the maturity curve that Motivebase examines and calculates to help us determine where on the journey of a particular trend or idea, where is it currently, how much is it growing, what's driving that growth, and so on. So it maps pretty nicely to that and allows us to determine very, very quickly where a particular idea or trend really sits currently and where it might end up in the future. And again, I'll show you some tangible examples as we go along. So a trend fundamentally though, when you bring all of this together, what does this teach us? It teaches us that a trend fundamentally is not a new behavior. It's not a new set of solutions. A trend isn't the new coffee shop you go to or the new machine that you just dropped 700 euros for. A trend is a changing set of beliefs. A trend is a clear pattern in which you can now see the beliefs transforming from beliefs about free trade and ethical trade practices to beliefs about tasting notes and terroir to now beliefs just about being cultured, enjoying good coffee. That changing set of beliefs, that is what makes a trend, which means if we need to understand whether a particular opportunity we're chasing down is truly a trend or not, is it on its way to becoming a trend or not, we need to determine where it currently sits in that journey. And secondly, whether we can clearly see patterns of those beliefs changing. And that's what I'm going to show you here and walk you through. But before we do that, we got to take a step back because how do we know, how do we identify whether these beliefs are changing? And again, I'm going to just scroll through the next couple of slides pretty quickly because I'm assuming that many of you have attended my past webinars, so I certainly don't want to belabor the same point again and again. But if you have not attended any past webinars, I would really urge you actually to look at the very first webinar we did on what is anthropology, if you'd like more information on this. But fundamentally, we use anthropology to identify these belief systems. And the way anthropology helps us do that is it looks at patterns of language within the context of a topic. So in this example on your screen, the topic is food. And what anthropology says is it's not enough to look at the directly connected topics to food. We have to look at both the direct and the indirectly connected topics to food if we truly want to understand the systems of meaning, the systems of beliefs that are emerging and starting to indicate where the culture of food or the meaning of food is headed. What anthropology in essence does is looks at the patterns of language use in the broader context of food. And that is really what we do at Lux Motive Base as well, is apply anthropology at scale in order to study these patterns of language use so that we can then extract systems of beliefs that are teaching us about the movement and evolution of these trends. So let me make this tangible. Here's an example of what, obviously this is a simplified example, but nonetheless an example of what the pattern of language looks like when you're staring at an ideological trend, i.e. a trend that is on the left end of the spectrum. You'll notice from the color coding here, there are actually three systems of meaning. They're all connected to one another, but they're three systems of meaning in one. And this example is on the topic of nutrition deficiency. The second thing you'll notice, and if you recall, the first thing I said to you on the left end of the spectrum is the conversation also tends to be more technical. So the second thing you'll notice is the conversation here, the patterns of language are quite technical. Nutrition deficiency connected to topics like access and quality, to topics like nutrition security, resourcing, capacity. These are all very technical topics, i.e. the consumer who engages on these topics has to have a lot of knowledge. These are not mainstream consumers. So this is how you can start to look at the patterns of language around an opportunity area that you're pursuing and very quickly ascertain that if the patterns of language are really technical still, it is likely still in the ideological stages. Now, here's an example of what happens to the same culture, nutrition deficiency, when it starts to come into the vulnerability stage. What you'll notice is deficiency has now changed into gaps in nutrition. So what does that mean? The technicality has softened a tad bit. The belief systems have softened or have started to soften. And now, so again, I'll flip back to the previous slide and flip forward. What you'll notice is, first of all, that from three systems of meaning, we're condensing down to two systems of meaning. Secondly, you'll notice some of the topics themselves have become a little more accessible. So nutrition gaps, specific discussions about B12 and B vitamins, connection between nutrition and sleep and energy. These are all things that mainstream consumers can slowly start to wrap their heads around, right? It's still fairly technical, I would argue, but at least it's starting to make a bit more sense to somebody who doesn't have deep knowledge on the world of nutrition and food. Now, let's take the same example and bring it into a trend mainstream phase. What's happened here is the diversity has become even less. So the topics have become less diverse. And then on top of that, now you'll see connections to issues like happiness, good sleep, good energy, and all of that getting connected to nutrition and even getting connected to diverse tastes and substitutions in the foods we eat and indulgences and so on. So this is basically a very tangible example and a very real example, by the way, of how a particular culture starts to indicate where it is in its journey. And by analyzing these systems of language and context, you yourself can start to identify and ascertain where in its journey a particular topic area or a particular opportunity might actually be. So why is it important? Why is the phase important for you? How does it impact your execution? How does it prevent you? Let's come back to the original subject that we're addressing here in this webinar, right? How does it impact how you value these opportunities? Here's how. If an idea is in the ideological stages, it means you're dealing with a niche, highly knowledgeable audience base, and these audiences require not only technical solutions, they require alignment on purpose. Think back to that coffee example. If you're in the ideological stages and you're trying to sell these people, you have to align on their sense of purpose, their sense of ethics around the production, the compensation, the distribution of these coffee beans. You have to align on purpose, right? And typically, if all of us come from large organizations, it's harder for us to align on ideological purpose in this manner. So we tend to wait till smaller companies that align on this purpose become large enough and we acquire them. So more than likely, you're not going to chase down an opportunity that sits in there unless you have a member company, an acquired company that sits there. You can certainly drive that. So let's come on to the vulnerability stage. This is really where, as a large organization, you would start to pay more attention, because this is sort of the stage where, especially from an innovation standpoint, if you've got anywhere from a 2+ year, but 2 to 5 year horizon, this is the stage where you'll tend to focus a lot of your energy. Vulnerability stage is a stage where the solutions are starting to get a bit simplified, right? To go back to coffee, now you're starting to get access to these single origin beans, let's say. They're a bit more convenient, but they're still fairly technical, i.e., they still are sitting in the culture of deep tasting notes and understanding terroir and the region and the climate and all of that stuff. And they sell at a premium price point. That's the vulnerable stage. Typical pattern, right? Premium price point, still a bit technical. You don't have to align on purpose so strongly, but nonetheless, it's a bit more accessible but technical. Finally, when it starts to come into the trend phase, that solution gets even further simplified, extremely convenient. Prices start getting affordable, and then as a result, the consumer knowledge required to access them becomes extremely low. And that's the stage we sit in right now with coffee culture. You can go to a really hip coffee shop, you can buy coffee, you have to have no knowledge about the coffee you're buying, and you can simply taste it and go, hey, this is great, this is better than the other coffee shop or that other coffee I drink, right? So you can still do that and enjoy that experience. So first of all, knowing the stage impacts the type of solution you can bring to life. Pretty obvious. Now here's the other aha that we've sort of had doing this type of work, doing anthropology at scale for more than a decade now. I have never seen, we've looked at thousands of trends, never seen a particular trend coming to the mainstream where the leader, right, the leading solution has led from the ideology stage. I've never seen that. Usually, leaders are born in the vulnerability stage. Why is that the case? I mean, we can pontificate. I think the most common scenario is companies that lead in the ideological stages usually get stuck in the ideological stages, and new companies get spun up in the vulnerability stage. They borrow from the ideology, they simplify the solution, they bring it to life, and usually establish their leadership position and eventually end up in the mainstream. So here's the other thing too, even from an M&A standpoint, generally you would look for solutions that are in the vulnerability stage, not for solutions, brands, products that are in the ideological stage, because that is also the stage where there's a lot of misfires in terms of these companies actually making the transition into vulnerability and trend. So typically leaders in the mainstream stage come from leaders in the vulnerability stage. So that has two implications, both from an M&A standpoint, but also from the standpoint of product development. You don't want to start developing products and solutions when a territory, when a space that you're chasing after is still in the ideological stages. That's too early. You don't want to be doing that. You want to wait until it really comes into the vulnerability stages. Now, here are a couple of really tangible examples. These maturity curves obviously come from Lux Motive Base. I think many of you will be familiar with these. Here's an example, very tangible example. Here we're looking at the trend or the connection between inflation and sustainability. For those of you who attended my last webinar where we decoded the impact of inflation on sustainability, this will look a little bit familiar. In essence, this is an example of a trend that is still in the ideological stages, in that the conversation is still quite technical, and the conversation is growing, as in the culture is maturing. It is becoming less diverse with time, and that's what the system is telling us, but it's still not headed into the mainstream. There's going to be time required here, and it's a slow burn. Here's an example of a vulnerable culture. This is the nutrition deficiency example I used earlier, measured through motive base, where you can see it's an early consensus, but it's growing into mainstream acceptance stage, where the machine can clearly measure and show you that the topic universe is becoming less diverse with time. In fact, in the next 24 months, headed into mainstream relevancy. And then lastly, this is an example of the body neutrality trend. The body neutrality trend, for those of you who may not be aware, is in essence the new version of body positivity. Body positivity was one of those trends that sort of hit mainstream and had a bit of a reset. And this also tends to happen many times, by the way. Just because something moves in this linear manner doesn't mean it always must progress in a linear manner. Stuff does reset when things happen in culture that we cannot control. But what we can do as anthropologists is measure that when that reset happens and help you understand and grapple with the implications of that. So this is a classic example where body positivity went through a bit of a reset, has transitioned into body neutrality, which now sits in the mainstream acceptance stage and is continuing to grow, but an example of something that is past vulnerability into mainstream. And again, I think the other important point just to illustrate here, which I sort of forgot to illustrate, so I'll pop back a couple of slides just to further make the point, is when a culture sits like this, like the culture between inflation and sustainability, and you transition to a culture like this on body neutrality, the transition you're also making is from a very technical knowledge base, from a very technical language around consumer language around these topics, to a very mainstream, less technical, accessible language coming from the consumer. So that's important to also keep in mind here. So what are our takeaways from this session? What do I really want to leave you with? The first thing I want to leave you with is, if you think back to any moments in time where you thought you overvalued, and by the way, overvaluing is actually the most common thing that tends to happen. Uh, of course, we also tend to experience moments where sometimes we undervalue things and it's too late, and then we try to do a fast follow and so on. But overvaluing is the most common thing I've certainly seen. Every time you think back to one of those moments, it's important to realize that the reason that's happening is because we haven't truly understood and we haven't truly agreed internally on what we define as a trend. And I want to set the record straight. A trend is not a new solution. It's not a new product. It's not a new behavior. Those are all outcomes of trends. They're manifestations of trends. A trend is a shifting set of beliefs. And your job really is to identify these shifts before your competition can, so that you can lead the way, right? Ultimately, that is your job if you work in innovation. And we believe anthropology is a very critical tool in helping you achieve that. So what are those three stages? How do we identify these shifting beliefs? Every trend must go through these three stages. Begin with ideology, transition to vulnerability, and eventually into mainstream. Does every trend or does every new idea make it into mainstream? Absolutely not. There are many that will fall short. And we'll try to talk a little bit more about that, and perhaps even do a follow-up session on that if this is of interest to you. And certainly feel free to leave us some comments if this is an important topic for you, and I'm happy to do some additional sessions on this as well. And then lastly, how does this impact how you value opportunities? Very simple. Determine what stage your opportunity sits in and accordingly figure out what strategies you can employ. Does something sit in vulnerability? If yes, it's ripe for innovation, but you got to think about how quickly it might make its way out of vulnerability stage. and what kinds of solutions you're bringing to life. You have to think, as I said earlier, about whether your solution is too technical or too generic, because it's got to strike that balance. You got to think about whether your solution can be offered at a premium price point if it's in the vulnerability stage, but can it eventually adapt itself into a more affordable price point? These are all topics and questions that you got to think about depending on the stage you find your opportunity in. But that's it. That's really, those are the three key things I'd like you to take away from this session. Is when you value trends, think about what is a trend ultimately, think about what stage it sits in, and then think about whether your solution is meeting the cultural requirements of that stage. That's it. I'll open to questions. Thanks again for tuning in.
All right, thank you, Ushma. We'll now be taking questions that you may have on this presentation, and I can think of a couple. I think it was a very thought-provoking presentation, but I'm biased, don't take my word for it. You can type your questions in the questions box, and if we do not get to your question on this call, then someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. And again, also feel free to send in your questions to questions@luxresearchinc.com. So let's see what we have here. A couple of interesting discussions going on here, which will. So one is about that transition to becoming vulnerable.
Yeah.
There's actually two questions here, but I'm gonna combine them because I think it will be a better discussion that way. So first is there a guarantee of sorts, right? Do our ideologies eventually become vulnerable, or are there many ideologies that just get stuck being an ideology? That's one question, and the other one related to that perhaps is, can ideologies become vulnerable in multiple ways? So in a way, can one ideology spawn multiple trends, or can there be kind of a bifurcation there? What have you seen in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll use a great example for this. Let's take plant protein, the trend, and I'm air quoting, the trend of plant protein. This is a great example, actually, of a trend that actually began with a very strong ideology that started with basically the ideological underpinnings were about sustainability, and they were in particular about human health and sustainability. Now, here's the funny thing. When that ideology transitioned into the vulnerability stage, the sustainability quotient of it softened significantly, and it became a lot more about nutrition. It became a lot more about accessibility, so cheaper price points, and it became a lot more about health and healthfulness. Whereas the sustainability part of that culture has kind of gotten stuck in the ideology stage. So here's why this is an important topic and an important example. Because plant protein is discussed so much in our culture, we have been led to believe that this is a mainstream trend. But plant protein by itself is stuck in the vulnerability stage. So one aspect of it made it into vulnerability, which is the focus on human health, but it's stuck in the vulnerability stage. Another aspect of it, which was the focus on the environment, is stuck in the ideological stage because the conversations are still very technical. It hasn't softened. There's deep debate on what is the best way to grow certain crops, what is more sustainable, even in the plant-based universe. So that debate, because it's not resolving itself, it's sort of stuck there. Why is this important? Because look at what's happening in the marketplace. It's flooded with plant-based solutions that are marketing themselves as more sustainable, healthier, and yet everybody's experiencing problem after problem in terms of not meeting their growth targets, their sales targets. Why is that the case? Because they have not understood that there's actually sort of two tracks that's come out of the plant universe, one stuck in ideology, one stuck in vulnerability, neither of them in mainstream. So this does happen, and the best way to understand this is by looking at the contextual map of language use, and you'll see that the vulnerable part of the culture is softening in beliefs. It is becoming less technical, but it's very much about human health, but it's not transitioning over yet. It's not certainly not transitioning in terms of access to cheap products. It's not transitioning in terms of everyday consumers understanding and linking this to day-to-day issues they have. So that's one great example. Another example I want to bring up is the whole natural skincare movement. Another example that actually did transition from ideology to vulnerability, but also stuck in vulnerability. But another great example because it's overvalued. The marketplace is flooded with natural skincare solutions, but of course, nobody seems to know what natural really means. There's a lot of disagreement on it, and as a result, it's also stuck in the vulnerability stage. So I wanted to bring up these two examples because they're great examples of A, how we overvalue certain opportunities, and B, how it also then teaches us about the fact that not all things, to your point, are linear. Sometimes some things do get, do follow the linear path, and other times they don't.
Right. So that again triggers quite a. You should see. I don't know if you're watching, but you should see the discussion going on there in the questions box. Because like me, some of our audience are probably engineers, so
Yeah.
they really want to unstick things. If it's stuck in the ideology stage, we want to fix, right? Do you think that's possible? Are there things that companies could do to move an ideology along on its way to becoming a trend?
Absolutely, absolutely. Look, I'll give you a great example. Um, Look at mainstream apparel manufacturers right now that will sell you a pair of jeans that is made with recycled denim that uses 80% less water. These are all examples of ideas where something was unstuck, sort of. It went from an ideological stage to a vulnerable stage by companies introducing these solutions. So the easiest way to think about it, even from an engineering standpoint, is think back to, and I'm going to actually scroll back here, think back to this slide here. Just bear with me. This slide here, if something is stuck in the ideological stages and you want to move it into the vulnerability stage, what you have to do, let's think purely from an engineering standpoint, is ask yourself the question, hey, can I introduce a simplified solution against the incumbent that is stuck in the ideological stage? Can I introduce a simplified solution that is a bit more accessible, that is less technical, but will appeal to an audience that is willing to pay and has the means to pay a premium for it? That's really the question to ask. If the answer is yes, then you can very much unstick something, if you will. And that is certainly an opportunity. And then the same applies from vulnerability to trend as well. And oftentimes you'll see this if you certainly work in the innovation space. Things move from one stage to the next, usually because new solutions or new companies come on the landscape and they find ways to do something in a simpler way, in a more accessible way. And that's really a good way to think about how to move something along if it's really important to your business.
All right. So we have time for one more short question and a short answer. And it's really about that other side. Remember the right-hand side,
Yes.
the part that's
Yeah.
resisting?
Yes.
You haven't really talked about it in this webinar so much, except that it exists.
Yes.
Should we be doing something about that? Should we be trying to unpack that side of the debate as well? And if so, and I know I'm risking a very long answer here, but we only have time for a short one. So
I'll be
let's keep it to the closed question.
Yes.
Should we mind the resisting part as well?
For now, the answer is no. And the reason is that the right end of the spectrum, what's happening is they are never the creators of trends. They're always the blockers, and the right end usually dwindles in population as time goes on. So that's the shortest way I can answer this question. So for now, we don't need to worry about that from an innovation standpoint. But I do think it's worthwhile. Certainly, if it's of interest to you, do not hesitate to leave us a comment. Happy to take that on in a follow-up session and get deeper into that as well.
All right, thank you very much as well. And that concludes our webinar for today. I can see there's a couple more questions, but like I said, we'll get back to you on your questions. Likewise, the slide presentation and the recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees through email today. And after leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. And we would, of course, appreciate any feedback you may have so that we can improve our future webinars. Also take a moment, check out our upcoming webinars, both the technical large research and the anthropological motive-based webinars. So thanks for joining us and have a great rest of your day.